The house over here on the right was originally back up on the slave quarters, a slave quarter plantation, and they brought it down here because they were going to use it as a cook's cabin. The man who lived in it was born a slave to Patrick Henry. He was listed in Henry's will as a middle child of Critty. She had 3 children, and so we have no way of knowing exactly how old he was, but we assume that he must have been at least a year old when Patrick Henry died in 1799, and he was still living here in 1905, so that means he was at least 106 years old. He was part Indian. His mother was half Indian. His grandfather was Indian James or Indian Jim, who lived across the river at Patrick Henry's plantation on the Halifax side of the river. And James was brought here from North Carolina. They had captured a bunch of Indians and had sold them as slaves, and so they were here in this area, and originally belonged to a man downstream, a Mays, who had a ferry down a few hundred yards below where you can see. This half of Red Hill was left to John. Over on the mountains, I say the mountain, the rise over there, was the other half of Red Hill, which was inherited by Winston, and he renamed his half of the property Winston. If you see the hedgerow that's going down through the middle of the field over there, that was the road to a ferry on the river bank, and that went straight uphill to his house. So that gives you an idea of where Winston's house would have been located, how large the plantation was. We had 2,930 acres in this particular plantation, and the ferries changed names ever so often. It's hard to keep up with them because you would have, for 1 year they would be named one thing, and then the next year another thing, depending on what the landowner was. But down at Booker's Ferry, which was there when Patrick Henry bought the property, there was a big tobacco warehouse. And when Henry came here, he rented the property to a man named LeSueur, who was to maintain the warehouse and the ferry. And I don't know how long he kept it. It was the contract called for 1 year. That was in 1792 or 3, and I don't know how long he maintained that ferry. There was a spring down at the bottom of the hill, just beyond the where you see the blacksmith shop now, that was here when Henry was here, still in existence, and he used to drink water from the cool spring. They said he would sit in hot weather. He would sit out here under the locust trees in the front of the building and drink water from a dipper. And the Osage orange tree would have been here then, but if he wanted to look down and see the vista, he would have been sitting in front of the house. We don't know whether he used Osage orange for sitting or not. A few years ago, we had somebody came in with a metal detector and found a thimble under the tree about 6 or 8 inches deep in the ground. So evidently somebody had been sitting around at one time or another. The cedar trees that you see here, there's one right here, and there's the 2 over on the other side that are in very poor condition, were planted by John Henry. So that means they were here sometime between 1826 and 1868. We don't know the exact age of those. And the boxwood that's out just beyond the kitchen perhaps was Patrick Henry's. He had 6 boxwood in front of his house. When Elvira planted this garden, she moved them on either side of the walk. And if any here are his, that would be it. 1957, when they built the house, they had a necessary house right there, and that spot has been moved. Now, Mrs. Bellwood came in. She was the only employee who lived here. She and her sister lived in the house. They had converted part they started out converting part of William Wirt Henry, John Henry's law office, into the house, and then they just built a house over there. And she had to do all of the work. She did the yard work. They finally bought her a tractor, and so she mowed the grass, and they had the necessary house, and it was up to her to clean out that. She did all of the work here. It would be an impossible job now. She didn't have nearly as many visitors as we have today. The building that you see right here is the other side of Harrison's house. Harrison was, as I said, born here at Red Hill, and the building was beginning to fall down. It was deteriorating, and they had to saw off the logs about a foot off of each end to salvage as many as possible. So you have some new logs in the building, but as many as they could, were used from the original house. And it wound up being about 2 feet smaller than the house he lived in. It has a fireplace inside to heat the building and a little attic room upstairs, and a very comfortable house. The smokehouse, I have my doubts as to whether that was here when Patrick Henry was here. It would not have been, this would have been the front of the house when Patrick Henry was here, because the house faced the river. All of the old houses faced the river. And when John Henry built his addition, he had the main door facing the river, and so was Mrs. Harrison. So the smokehouse would not have been in this particular case when Patrick Henry lived here. The kitchen, a kitchen burned on the average of once every 5 years. We have no way of knowing exactly where the kitchen was to begin with. There was one here in 1905 when Mrs. Harrison built the house. It was beginning to fall down. She had Stanhope Johnson, who was a young architectural student working for Keene, the architect, and he did a detailed drawing of the kitchen. Then they tore it down. Then they moved Patrick Henry's house down this direction 20 feet so they could build another section to the main house to make it symmetrical. And when they got ready to do the reconstruction, Stanhope Johnson was a retired architect, so he was hired to come back here and to do the building of the reconstruction. So he had the original plans, and he had promised to give them to us when he died, but we never did get them. We don't know where they are right now, but he used the original drawings. The house, when it burned in 1919, all the rubble was just allowed to stand. When they got ready to do the reconstruction, they salvaged all of the bricks they could find and put them into this house. So we have bricks that are from 4 different eras, from Patrick Henry's era, from John Henry's and Mrs. Harrison's, and then we had a few, didn't have quite enough to finish, so they have some that were made in the 20th century.